Welcome back to God's story and our sacred journey, Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. In our last episode, we followed the Holy Family as they lived in Egypt, finding safety and purpose in a foreign land. Sarah is our guest today, and she is a Holy Family grandmother who lives at Holy Family's Son. Today, we witness their return to Israel and the prophetic encounter with Simeon and Anna in the temple. What does this moment reveal about the future of the Christ child? Let's uncover the meaning together.
Joseph lay upon the straw mattress, his body heavy with the weariness of countless days spent evading the shadow of Herod's wrath. The air in the humble dwelling was thick, laced with the scent of drying wood and the faint aroma of bread Maria had baked earlier. The room, small and dim, carried the hushed whispers of a night that held its breath. Outside, the wind moved like a gentle hand, and the winding shadows moved to create silence. Stroking the palm trees and stirring the coarse sands, Joseph's face, rugged and lined, spoke of toil and love, a man burdened by a divine charge greater than himself. His dreams had become a refuge, a space where angels tread, and this night was no different. As his chest rose and fell in deep rhythm, the light shifted, not the flicker of the oil lamp in the corner, but a celestial brilliance that filled the room like the sun spilling in its warmth after a cold storm. A figure, neither man nor shadow, emerged from the glow, its countenance serene yet commanding. The angel spoke, its voice resonating as if the heavens themselves were humming through the fibers of Joseph's being. "Joseph," it began, each syllable a balm for his soul, "rise. Take the child and his mother and return to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are no more." The words wrapped around him, bringing both relief and gravity. In his mind's eye, Joseph saw the face of Herod, a tyrant whose fear had driven him to unspeakable horrors. Yet, now that threat was gone. Even in sleep, Joseph's hands twitched, reaching for the tools of a carpenter, as though seeking something to anchor himself to this startling revelation. The angel lingered for a moment longer, its light brushing Maria's face, where she lay beside the child, Jesus, the infant. Stirred but did not wake, his tiny form cradled in a cocoon of innocence that belied the world's heavy expectations. Joseph's mind surged with questions, but the angel's presence left no room for doubt. Its purpose fulfilled, the light withdrew, fading into the thick embrace of the night. Awake now, though his eyes had not yet opened, Joseph felt the weight of the command. He sat upright, the rustling of straw drawing Maria's gaze. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice a tether pulling him from the edges of divine awe back to the simplicity of their life together. "The angel," he murmured, his words heavy yet sure. "It spoke to me again. We must return to Israel." Maria nodded, her eyes catching the flicker of determination in Joseph's. There was no hesitation, only a quiet resolve, a mother's trust in both her husband and the God they served. Around them, the night resumed its natural rhythm, but the air seemed lighter, as though the stars themselves had whispered their approval. Joseph rose, his steps purposeful despite the lingering fatigue. In his heart a new chapter had begun, and though uncertainty lay ahead, he carried the conviction that this journey was not just a return, but a fulfillment of a promise spoken in ancient prophecy. The road to Nazareth was long and winding, carved into the rugged hills that stretched endlessly before them. The sun, though not yet oppressive, cast its pale light over the land, illuminating every crack in the dry earth and every leaf trembling in the morning breeze. Joseph walked ahead, his sturdy frame carrying the weight of their journey, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if it held the promise of rest and renewal. Behind him, Maria cradled the child, her arms steady though her body swayed gently with the rhythm of the donkey's gait. Nazareth, the name brought memories flooding back, of quiet mornings and evenings filled with the hum of life unbroken by fear. It was home, and yet, after their years in Egypt, it felt like a distant dream, a place untouched by the trials they had endured. But now, with the angel's words echoing in their hearts, It was more than just a destination. It was a symbol of God's provision, a haven waiting to receive them once more. Maria glanced at Joseph, her eyes tracing the furrow of his brow. His steps were deliberate, each one seeming to carry the weight of his thoughts. She knew he carried more than the burden of the journey. He carried the responsibility of protecting a divine promise. Yet, even in his silence, she found reassurance. The way he adjusted the straps of the donkey's harness, the way he paused to ensure the path was safe, it all spoke of a love, unwavering and steadfast. The landscape shifted as they climbed higher. Olive trees, their ancient branches gnarled yet resilient, stood as silent witnesses to their passage. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint aroma of wild thyme and sage, crushed beneath the donkey's hooves. Maria tightened her hold on the child, whose small hand had escaped the confines of his swaddle to grasp the airlock, his tiny fingers exploring the world with a curiosity untainted by the struggles of the journey. As they neared a bend in the path, Joseph halted, his hand raised as if to command the world itself to pause. He turned, his voice breaking the stillness. "Maria," he said, his tone soft yet firm, "beyond this rise lies the road to Nazareth. We are almost home." Maria's heart quickened at the words, a flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She looked down at the child, his serene face a testament to the peace that seemed to elude the rest of the world. "Home," she whispered, the word tasting sweet on her lips. But it was not just a place. It was the promise of safety, the chance to build a life where God's presence would guide every step. The final stretch of their journey passed in a blur, the anticipation drawing them forward like an unseen hand. As the first rooftops of Nazareth came into view, a lump formed in Joseph's throat. It was not the Nazareth they had left, and yet it was. The same narrow streets, the same gentle hum of life, but now it carried a weight of purpose, a sanctity born of their shared trials and triumphs. Maria dismounted, her feet touching the earth with a reverence that matched her heart's silent prayer. "We are here," Joseph said, his voice heavy with emotion. "And so is he," Maria replied, her eyes lifting to the heavens. Together they stepped forward, carrying not just themselves, but a hope destined to change the world. The temple stood like a sentinel over Jerusalem, its white stone walls gleaming under the morning sun. The air was alive with the murmurs of pilgrims, their voices weaving a tapestry of prayer and anticipation. Among the throng was Simeon, an old man whose steps had grown slow but whose spirit burned. With an unyielding fire, he moved through the crowd as if guided by an unseen hand, his eyes searching, his heart pounding with the weight of an unspoken promise. Simeon had waited a lifetime for this moment. The words of the Spirit had been clear. He would not see death until his eyes beheld the Lord's Messiah. Each day he came to the temple, his faith as unshakable as the stones beneath his feet. And today, something was different. The air itself seemed to hum, charged with the anticipation of heaven. As he entered the inner court, his gaze fell upon a young couple standing quietly with their child. They were unremarkable in appearance, travelers, perhaps, with dust clinging to their garments and weariness etched into their faces. Yet to Simeon, they shone with a light that no earthly eye could ignore. He felt it in his bones, an aching certainty that this child was the one. Joseph stood protectively beside Maria, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Maria cradled the child, her movements tender and deliberate. The baby, so small and vulnerable, seemed to command the attention of the world itself. His eyes, impossibly deep for one so young, met Simeon's. And in that instant, the old man felt the breath of God move through him. Simeon approached, his hands trembling not with age but with awe. "May I?" he asked, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of the years. Maria nodded, her trust evident in the way she handed the child to him. As Simeon held the baby, tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. His voice, when it came, was rich and resonant, filling the temple's vast space. "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace according to your word," he said, his gaze never leaving the child's face. "For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelations to the Gentiles, the electus Son of Jesus Christ, and the sons of the highest of heaven, and the glory of your people Israel." The words hung in the air, a benediction that seemed to echo from the heavens themselves. Those nearby paused, their conversations silenced by the power of Simeon's proclamation. Even the priests turned their heads, drawn by a presence they could not explain. Maria and Joseph listened, their hearts swelling with a mix of pride and trepidation. Simeon's words were both a blessing and a warning. He turned to Maria, his eyes soft yet penetrating. "This child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel," he said, his voice heavy with the burden of truth. "And a sword will pierce your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed." Maria's breath caught, her grip tightening on Joseph's arm. She did not fully understand the meaning of Simeon's words, but their weight settled into her heart like a stone. Joseph stood silent, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on Simeon with a mix of respect and quiet determination. As Simeon returned the child to Maria, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that spoke of peace and fulfillment. His life's purpose had been realized, and in that moment, he felt the nearness of eternity. The crowd resumed its motion, the hum of the temple life returning, but for Simeon, time itself seemed to stand still. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze following the young family as they moved away. Though his legs were weak and his days few, his spirit soared. The Messiah had come, and the world would never be the same. Anna's days were marked by the steady rhythm of devotion. From dawn to dusk the temple courts were her home, and prayer was the language she spoke to the heavens. The lines on her face told a story of decades spent in the foretells presence of God. Her faith unwavering, even as the years weighed heavily on her frame. She was known by many, respected by all, a prophetess whose words carried the wisdom of a life steeped in scripture and communion with the divine. On this day something stirred within her. It was not an audible call but a pull, an irresistible force that drew her. To the inner courts where the faithful gathered, she moved with purpose, her aged hands clasping the staff that supported her steps. The temple seemed alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, its air charged with anticipation, and its shadows softened by an unexplainable light. As she entered, her eyes fell upon the scene that seemed to radiate from the center of the courtyard. A man, tall and vague, resolute, stood beside a young woman who cradled a child. They were not richly adorned, nor did they hold the bearing of nobility, yet Anna's heart knew what her eyes could not immediately discern. The child, this child, was the answer to prayers she had whispered through the long watches of the night. Without hesitation she approached, her steps quickened by a strength that belied her years. The crowd parted for her, their murmurs fading as they recognized the familiar figure of the prophetess. Hannah's voice, though cracked with age, rang clear and strong as she lifted it in praise. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel," she declared, her arms raised as though to embrace the heavens. "For he has fulfilled his promise to his people. This child is the most hardened leader of the people. He is the Redeemer, the light that will shine in the darkness and bring bon cushion bio barnia, salvation to all who believe." Her words drew the attention of every soul within earshot. Even those who had been consumed by their own prayers and mitigations flinched. Petitions paused, their gazes turning to the prophetess and the family she addressed. Joseph shifted uneasily, his protective instincts rising, but Maria's face remained calm, her eyes locked on Anna with a mixture of awe and reverence. Anna stepped closer, her gaze softening as she looked upon the child. "You are the one," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of realization. "The hope of Israel, the fulfillment of God's covenant." Her hand, frail but steady, hovered just above the child's head, as if to offer a blessing too sacred for words. Tears glistened in her eyes as she turned to the gathering crowd. "Rejoice, for God has not forgotten us," she proclaimed. "He has sent his Messiah to bring peace and redemption. Let this be a day remembered, a day when the promises of heaven touch the earth." Maria and Joseph exchanged a glance, the gravity of Anna's words settling upon them. Though they had been told of their secret, they could not explain their fright in a loud whisper to anyone. Child's destiny, each affirmation seemed to carry new weight, a reminder of the extraordinary role they had been called to play. As the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs filled with awe, Anna lingered. She watched the young family leave the Cresse courtyard, her heart swelling with both joy and sorrow. For though she had seen the Savior with her own eyes, she knew her time was drawing near. Yet she felt no fear. Her life's purpose had been fulfilled, her faith vindicated. She turned once more to the temple's sacred walls, her lips moving in silent prayer. The day faded into evening, the temple's stones bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. And as Anna disappeared into its shadows, her voice could still be heard, lifting praises to the God who keeps his promises. The road stretched before them, winding like a thread through the hills that stood stark against the pale sky. Maria walked beside Joseph, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but her thoughts turned inward. The words of Simeon echoed in her mind, each syllable etched as if by fire. A sword will pierce your own soul. What had he seen, she wondered, in the depths of her child's future? What burden lay ahead that could cut so deeply into her heart? Jesus slept in her arms, his small face serene, untouched by the weight of the prophecy. His innocence was a balm, yet it only deepened the ache that had taken root in her chest. She traced a finger lightly over his cheek, her touch as gentle as a whisper. How can such a small life carry the hopes of a nation, the weight of salvation itself? The path beneath their feet was dusty, each step stirring the earth into tiny clouds that clung to their sandals. Joseph walked a few paces ahead, his shoulders broad and steady against the shifting light. He had said little since they left the temple, his silence a shield against the thoughts that surely swirled within him. Maria could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the staff he carried. "Joseph," she called softly, her voice breaking the stillness. He paused, turning to meet her gaze. For a moment they said nothing, the silence between them heavy with shared understanding. Finally he nodded, as if to say, "I know." And in that simple gesture Maria felt a measure of strength return to her. The landscape around them seemed to mirror her thoughts, its beauty tempered by its harshness. Olive trees dotted the hillsides, their soaring branches crudely dangling. Branches twisted and gnarled as if shaped by the winds of countless seasons. The air carried the faint scent of wild thyme, mingling with the fragrant, earthy aroma of the dust they disturbed. It was a landscape both barren and alive, a reflection of the tension that tugged at Maria's heart. She thought of the stories she had heard as a child, of the prophets who had foretold the coming of the Messiah. Their words had always seemed distant, belonging to a future she would never see, and yet, here she was, walking beside the one they had spoken of, cradling him in her arms. The enormity of it all pressed down on her and she felt her steps falter. But then she looked at Jesus, and the world seemed to hold its breath. His tiny fingers curled into a fist, his lips parting in a soft sigh as he slept. There was a peace about him that defied explanation, a quiet assurance that seemed to say, "All will be well." Maria took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs and steady her spirit. She had been chosen for this, just as Joseph had been, just as Jesus had been. The path ahead might be fraught with trials, but it was a path laid by the hand of God, and that, she realized, was enough. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Maria whispered a silent prayer, not for understanding, but for strength, for faith, for the courage to face whatever lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that they walked not alone, but with the presence of the divine. And so they walked on, the horizon before them glowing with the golden promise of a new day, the words of prophecy now a quiet rhythm in Maria's heart. Not a burden, but a song of trust and hope. Night had fallen by the time they reached their resting place. The small fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the faces around them, of Maria and Joseph. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of crickets hidden among the sparse shrubs. Above them, The chimney peaks peaked, the branch stars hung like a tapestry, brilliant and endless, as though heaven itself leaned closer to hear their prayers. Joseph knelt beside the fire, his hands clasped tightly as he stared into the flames. The day's journey weighed heavily on him, and momentarily he forgot the world outside, the only one he could control, the world within, which gave satisfaction, pleasure, and safety. Not just in body but in spirit. The words of Simeon and Anna replayed in his mind, their weight a heavy stone resting on his heart. What did it mean, this destiny foretold for the child? And how could he, a mere carpenter, shoulder the responsibility of guiding and protecting the Savior of the world? Maria sat a short distance away, cradling Jesus in her arms. The child had stirred briefly, but now lay peaceful, his tiny hand resting against her chest. She watched Joseph, her own thoughts mirroring his. The enormity of their role had never felt more real than it did. Now, in the quiet of the night, with only the firelight and the stars to witness their struggle. "Joseph?" she said softly, her voice carrying the gentleness of the evening. He looked up, his face etched with weariness, but also with a quiet resolve. "We must trust," she continued, her words steady though her heart trembled. "The angel's message, the prophecies, they are not ours to fully understand. We are but instruments in God's hands." He nodded, his gaze shifting from her to the child. "I know," he replied, his voice low but firm, "but knowing does not make it easier." His hand reached out, brushing the edge of the fire's glow. "How do we prepare for a future we cannot see? How do we raise him, Maria, knowing what he is meant to become?" Maria was silent momentarily, her eyes falling to the sleeping child. "We do it with faith," she said, at last, her words carrying a quiet conviction, faith that the same God who called us to this will also give us the strength to fulfill it. Joseph closed his eyes, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He drew a deep breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. "Yes," he murmured, as much to himself as to her. "Faith." The fire crackled again, a brief burst of sparks rising into the darkness before fading. Around them, the night seemed to embrace their silence as if it too carried the weight of their prayers. Joseph shifted, his hand reaching for a small pouch at his side. He pulled out a piece of bread, breaking it in two and offering half to Maria. She accepted it with a small smile, the simple gesture a reminder of their shared life, a life woven together by hardship and hope, by love and trust in the unseen. As they ate, their eyes met, and in that moment, no words were needed. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable, a shared determination to walk this path, no matter how uncertain. Maria laid Jesus down gently, wrapping him in a soft cloth before placing him in the crook of her arm. She and Joseph knelt together. "You feel so relaxed." Beside the fire, their heads bowed. "Lord," Joseph began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "we are your servants. Guide us, strengthen us, and let your will be done through us." Maria's voice joined his, soft and steady. "Protect this child, and prepare our hearts for what lies ahead. We trust in you, even when we cannot see the way." Their prayers rose with the smoke of the fire, carried into the vastness of the night. As they lay down to rest, the stars shone brighter, a silent promise from the heavens that they were not alone. The night was calm, the kind of stillness that seemed to cradle the world in a moment of peace. An old shepherd sat near a small fire, his flickering light painting shadows on his weathered face. His hands, calloused from years of labor, rested on his knees as he stared. The woman was trembling, but she tried to feign independence. Into the embers, his mind wandering to the stories he had heard as a child. The fire snapped, sending a brief shower of sparks into the cool air, but he didn't flinch. His eyes, tired but sharp, lifted to the stars above. They seemed brighter tonight, as though the heavens themselves leaned closer to hear his thoughts. He had lived a long life, seen the ebb and flow of seasons, the rise and fall of kings. Yet, through it all, one truth had remained steadfast. God's promises never failed. He shifted slightly, his old bones protesting, and began to speak. His voice was low and rough, but there was a warmth to it, a quiet conviction. He shook his head, drew in the young shepherds who had gathered nearby. Simeon, he said, the name carrying a weight of reverence, was a man of great faith. It became the new covenant. He waited and he hoped, and in the end, he saw what God had promised, the child. He saw the Messiah. The younger men leaned in, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow. The old shepherd continued, his words deliberate, as though he were weaving a tapestry with his voice. And Anna, he said, his tone softening, she, too, waited. Her days were long, but her faith was longer. From the quietest days, she saw the child and knew, just as Simeon did, that he was the one who would change the world. The fire crackled again, the sound filling the brief silence that followed his words. One of the younger shepherds spoke, his voice hesitant. "Do you think," he began, "that we will see him again, that we'll see what Simeon and Anna saw?" The old shepherd smiled, a small knowing curve of his lips. "We see him every day," he replied, "in the sunrise that warms the earth, in the lands we tend, in the kindness we show one another. His light is here even now. But yes," he added, his voice taking on a during the war. Firmer edge, one day we will see him again, not as a child, but as a king. The younger men exchanged glances, their faces a mix of wonder and contemplation. The old shepherd leaned back, his gaze returning to the fire. "The stories of Simeon and Anna," he said, his voice quieter now, "remind us that faith is not in vain, that waiting is not wasted. God keeps his promises even if it takes a lifetime." He paused, his eyes lifting to the stars once more. "And those promises," he continued, "are not just for Simeon and Anna. They are for us." Fred sighed. "For you, for the world." The fire burned lower, its light growing softer, but the old shepherd's words lingered in the air, carried on the night breeze. The young men sat in thoughtful silence, their hearts stirred by the simple yet profound truth they had heard. As the fire's embers faded to a warm glow, the old shepherd closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. His heart was light, and he cried softly, yawning. Then, with considerable effort, he contracted his paws and drew his legs up to a wash basin, his spirit at peace. He had shared the story, passed it on like a torch, and in doing so, he had kept the promise alive.
Thank you for joining us in this powerful chapter of Christmas, a sacred journey to salvation. If this story inspired you, share it with those who need hope and let us know your thoughts below. In our final episode, we'll reflect on the fulfillment of the prophecies and the eternal light of salvation. Subscribe to God's Story and enable notifications so you don't miss this meaningful conclusion. See you soon.